and get started again. If you start, if you're having difficulty hearing at all, we'll need to fill in further, but if you can hear from the back, that'll be fine, but you might need to move forward. I'm really pleased to have Dr. Wood come down and visit. I was really pleased to have the STEM Gateway program bring him down to talk to us. It's unusual to have opportunity to have someone to discuss with who has such a distinguished track record in both his research and his teaching education. So I've sent around emails before already knowing that Bill's been a long-term member of the National Academy of Sciences and is working on developmental biology and C. elegans. And what I haven't sent around as much is that he's been also doing a lot of biology education for a long time, working on books for that and workshops. And for the last 10 years, this is as a recent example because the list is too long to go on, he's had a National Academy workshop, the National Academy Summer Institute for Undergraduate Education in Biology, okay, that he offers for faculty to come up for 4 days at a time and get some training. They've got 7, I think, locations now around there, including up in Boulder. So it's a great place that if you like the things that he talked about here today, that might be a very good thing for some of us to go to in the future. But without further ado, I'd like to just welcome Bill to our department. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So the reason he was asking you all to move down front is because my voice doesn't carry very well. And I was counting on a mic, which I don't have. So if you can't hear me, please do move down. I'd like to thank you all for the invitation. Gary Smith set this up through the STEM Gateway program, as Dave said. And he asked me to talk a little bit about both the rationale for why I think we need to do some changes in the way we teach, and also a little bit about how we can go about doing that. And so this is what I plan to do, is spend the first half or so talking about why I think we should change. And some of you may be sold on this already and others not. So we'll talk about what students are learning, some alternative approaches to the traditional method of teaching, and some of the evidence that alternatives work better. And then spend the last part on why change is so difficult, what are some of the barriers that we have to overcome, and then use the University of Colorado as a case study where we've had a program that Carl Wyman started there about 6 years ago that attempted to really change the teaching culture in 5 different departments at once, STEM departments. And I'll talk a little bit about how that process worked and how successful it was. So I'm going to make some generalizations here and make some fairly dogmatic, assertive statements. And they don't necessarily apply to everyone in this room, but they're backed up by national surveys and evidence from education research. And so I'll start by just saying that something that I think a lot of people generally accept, that we're not doing a very good job at teaching science to most undergraduates, especially in the large courses at the introductory level. And the problems, some of the problems are too much emphasis on factual knowledge, too little on conceptual understanding and science skills and the nature of science. And one of the consequences is that a lot of talented students drop out. Some of you probably know about this study that was done 16 years ago now, but it's still, more recent things have borne that out, that more than half of the students who declare a STEM major as freshmen drop out before they graduate, and either drop out of college or switch to other fields. And it's not the poor students who are always dropping out. Some of the most talented students are dropping out. And Seymour and Hewitt's study showed that one of the major reasons is because of the way the introductory courses are taught, that they simply turn off the students, and they're not presenting science as it really is, but just as a collection of facts. And the students decide history might be more interesting. And so at least part of the problem is the way we teach. And I'm going to argue that there are problems both with what we generally ask students to learn, and also the way we go about teaching them. So one way of thinking about what we're asking them to learn is something called Bloom's taxonomy. How many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy? Okay, so this was developed by an American educator named Benjamin Bloom back in the 1950s, and he basically realized that you could divide knowledge into different levels of understanding, so down at the bottom of this pyramid is simply factual knowledge. You don't need to understand things very well in order to regurgitate facts. And when you get up toward the top, where you want to defend a position or to make a synthesis of new ideas, you really need to have a pretty high level of understanding. And he stated that you can state these things in terms of the verbs that you would ask a student to do in order to demonstrate understanding at that level. So if you want to demonstrate factual knowledge, you can ask students to define things or list things or just state things. Up at the top here, you would ask them to create something, propose an experiment, design a control, justify a position about some biological question, and so on. And a couple of years ago, 2 large surveys were done where the researchers looked at the biology final exams for the introductory courses in many courses across the country, more than 100 courses, and found that if you bloom these questions on these exams, it's now used as a verb. So if you bloom the exam questions on these exams, 95% of them are levels 1 and 2. Not very demanding. If you look at the MCAT, the GRE AP biology exam, especially the new AP biology exam that was just launched this year, it's a little better. There's some questions in this middle level. But if you ask employers or graduate student admissions people, what are the skills that you really want incoming students to have, or ask students what it is they would like to get out of their college education, it's these things up here. So we're not, in general, we're not teaching the things that students really want to and need to learn in order to succeed in whatever they're going to do next. So we're asking them to learn mostly factual information. We're not challenging them enough to develop these higher level thinking skills. And I think I'm going to say that part of the reason is the way we teach. So let me give you a 2-minute, my 2-minute version of educational psychology. Up until about 80 years ago, the prevalent view among educators was that students were empty vessels. You've seen this kind of a diagram, a picture before. And that the professor's job, the instructor's job is to fill their heads with information by telling them what they know. And in the 1930s, several educators developed what we now call a constructivist view, which views the learning process as more of building of some kind of a knowledge structure inside your head. So I'm representing it as a little tree here that starts off sort of small and scrawny when you're little, and then as you learn things and experience things, you grow that tree into something with a lot of branches, and that's the way you see the world. And if I teach you something that relates to one of the branches on your tree, it's easy for you to retain it because it fits into your picture of the way things are. But if I try to teach you something that's not on your tree, which is the case for a lot of incoming freshmen, when you start teaching them introductory biology, it's much harder to integrate that into their understanding of the world. So these two views of education imply very different roles for an instructor, right? If you're a transmissionist, you think you can simply tell the students what you know and then they'll know it. And the constructivist instructor is more of a facilitator or a coach who sets up learning situations that it facilitates your ability to construct your own knowledge by going through a process of solving a problem or doing an exercise. I think everybody would pretty much agree that the constructivist view is the way that learning works, more or less. And yet, most instructors are still teaching by lecturing. So there's a real disconnect here. Facts can be transmitted by lecturing, but students won't necessarily remember them. It's much harder. You can't really transmit lasting conceptual understanding and skills by lecturing because they require practice, active engagement. So, I'm going to lecture to you about trying to change concepts of teaching, and it's not going to work. But before giving up in despair, let me make two arguments to add on to what I've said already. One is sort of a common sense or experiential argument that I think if you think about it, you've experienced this yourself. If you ask almost anybody in the educational system, what are the most important things for students to learn during their college education, for example, they'll come up with some of these things. Content, of course, is part of it, but the things that people tend to think are most important are we want to develop critical thinking skills and analytical skills, learn about experimental design and so forth. And interestingly, if you ask students at the beginning of a course or beginning of their freshman year, what do you hope to get out of your major? You'll get a list like this, and not very much about factual content. People, they assume, you know, we're going to obviously pick that up, and it's important, and it's essential, and we're going to pick it up along the way, but that's not what we're really here for. And you get the same list if you ask an administrator, what do you want your students to learn? Critical thinking, whatever that actually means. These are skills, and it's like learning to play the piano or hit a tennis ball. You've got to practice them in order to learn them. You can't simply get them by having people show you what playing the piano looks like or how to hit a tennis ball. So it's a constructivist process, and it requires practice. And so the faculty need to act as coaches. It's more important to have a good coach than somebody who transmits information, because you can get information off the web or textbooks or a variety of places. The other argument I wanted to make relates to the idea of, well, I came up through the traditional method of education. Probably most of you did too, and we're doing pretty well. So why is there a problem? And it always seems to me that biologists in particular should appreciate that we're the product of a selection process. We were good at that kind of learning. We probably did a lot of active learning, even in class, because that's the way our brains worked. You know, when somebody was lecturing, we were thinking about what they were saying. But not everybody learns that way. And so by sticking to this traditional method, we exclude a lot of very smart students who simply aren't going to be able to pick things up that way. So, what can we do about that? I think one instructive way to start thinking about this is to think about what a tutor does in an individual tutoring situation. And so I'm going to show you this is an experiment that was done by the same Benjamin Bloom and his graduate students back in the early 1980s, where he wanted to compare traditional instruction, in this case at the middle school level, with individual tutoring, which he thought was probably the ultimate form of teaching. So he got a group of matched groups of middle school students, and one group had 3 weeks of traditional instruction, the other group had daily sessions, same amount of time with a tutor. And then at the end, he gave them a suitable assessment as to what they'd been studying, And they found large increases for all the students. And in fact, the standard deviation was 2 sigma improved for the tutored students. So this is sometimes called Bloom's 2 sigma experiment. So the average for the group with individual tutors was better than 98% of the students. So all the students could learn given really good instruction. And then this became, Bloom was just picking people who had been shown to be good tutors. He didn't analyze what they were doing. But then later, this group looked at what tutors actually do in order to get these results. And these are some of the things they found. They put things into a real-world context so the students can connect with them and why they're important. They hardly ever tell the students anything. They teach by asking questions, drawing the student out, leading it on. So the students spend most of their time answering questions and explaining their answers. And educators call this formative assessment. You're getting feedback not for the purposes of judging the student, but just to see where they are. So as a result of this, the tutor understands very clearly exactly what students understand and what they don't understand. And they can give appropriate feedback, and they can ask questions that are challenging but not too challenging so the students don't get discouraged, and lead them systematically toward things of increasing difficulty. They let the students make mistakes and fix them by themselves. And finally, they ask students to think about how they're thinking, which educators call metacognition. Think about how did you solve that problem, and what did you have to do in order to get to the answer. So you can say, well, what does this have to do with teaching a huge science course? Kimberly Tanner and I, in this article, argued that you can really apply a lot of the same principles in a large class that you do in the tutorial situation. That what the expert tutors are doing is facilitating constructivist learning. They're coaching their students toward learning. And we have an additional advantage in a large class, which the tutor doesn't have, in that you can use group work to supplement all the other things you're doing. And I'm not going to say too much about group work today, but there's a big body of evidence showing that students learn more effectively in a social situation where they are interacting with each other and learning from each other than in a one-on-one situation. All right, so time's up?
Yeah.
So what are some of the constructivist alternatives? Well, I'm not going to belabor this. You know many of the things. Clicker questions is one that I like, and I'll talk more about that tomorrow in the workshop. You can do group problem solving. You can analyze data from a research paper. There are lots of things you can do, and almost anything, but preferably cooperative and with feedback that requires students to really think about things and get engaged, talk to each other, and verbalize their conclusions and their arguments rather than just record facts for memorizing later. So active learning activities. And I'm not saying that lecturing is bad, but just that it's not sufficient, because to learn the skills, you need practice, and the practice to be productive requires coaching, and that's different from lecturing to transmit information. So let me say a little bit about the evidence. You can legitimately ask, well, how do you know? Are students actually learning more when you do this kind of teaching or not? Well, right up when you run up against a problem, how are you going to measure learning? If I want to, so if you think about this like a scientist, you want to determine whether you're getting a particular outcome or not, and what the magnitude is. You've got to have an assay, right? You've got to have a way to actually measure student learning. And so, just the way you would in a laboratory experiment or a field experiment, you've got to first define specifically what your goal is, what your learning objectives are, and then you have to have some kind of an assessment that will measure student progress toward those objectives. And these are two fairly simple additions to course design, which I think anybody can do without a lot of extra, well, some extra work, but I'll talk about that in a minute. And once you do this, once you have an essay and a set of specific objectives, you can now compare different methods and just measure what works better in terms of learning outcomes. So let's talk about these in turn. First of all, it demands replacing the simple syllabus that many courses utilize with specific learning objectives. And so this process is called backward design sometimes, because what you're really, if you think about designing a course, the first thing you do is write the final exam, essentially. Think about what do you want students to be able to do at the end of the course? And then how are you going to measure it? And then what are you going to do in class to help make this happen? And I will refer as we go along to student-centered teaching, or learner-centered teaching, which really means facilitating active learning, allowing students to utilize the class for active learning. So here's an example. Our introductory genetics course used to start off like this. We'd review the central dogma, and we'd have a lecture on review of transcription. And that was what the students knew about what we were going to do. And the difference here with learning objectives is that the learning objectives are student-centered. Instead of what the instructor is going to do, you're focusing on what are the students, what are the outcomes you hope going to be, what are your objectives. So you might start by saying, well, I'll break this down. I want them to understand the process of transcription. I want them to understand what it does for the cell. Maybe I want them to understand that it can be regulated, so different cells make different transcripts. So what would be wrong with using these as my learning objectives for the course?
Your syllabus is going to be a book.
It'll be longer than a one-page set of titles, yeah? Yeah, how are you going to measure whether students understand the process of transcription? It has to be some performance-based measurement, right? So you've got to have the learning objectives to be useful have to be accessible, testable. So here's some sample specific learning objectives that you might come up with. I want students to be able to define transcription. I want them to be able to describe the process. I want them to be able to draw a picture of what's going on. I might want them to interpret or predict the result of some kind of an experiment like this. Compare different systems. Design an experiment to answer a specific question about transcription. So what do you notice about this list? There are different Bloom's levels, remember that I showed you before, and they all start with verbs. You notice they're all active verbs that you could ask the student to do. So these could be final exam questions, and they're quite specific. So it'll be easy to find out whether students can do this or not by asking them to do it. So here's some different Bloom's levels in here. And so these are the helpful verbs if you're trying to write testable learning objectives, these active verbs. How about measurement of student learning? You can't, ideally, I think, the way this should be done is to give a pre-test and a post-test, so you can measure not just how much they know at the end of the course, but how much did they gain during the course as a result of instruction. And so you need an exam or an assessment which is, first of all, aligned with your learning objectives. It's going to test those objectives. And then it ought to be free of jargon and technical terms that students coming into the course may not know yet. So you'd like to be able to see what kind of an understanding they have when they start. And it should be a validated test. That means tested in the way that, or validated in the way that people validate things like the SAT exam a little bit. You've shown that the questions, by using it on large numbers of students, you can say, yes, the questions are appropriately difficult, they're not too easy or not too hard. They're internally consistent, they're actually testing what I think they're testing, and that they consistently distinguish between stronger and weaker students. So just a robust kind of a test. And so there's bad news and good news about this. The bad news is that designing and validating such an assessment is a lot of work. And the good news is that there are already quite a few out there which are pretty good, some of them. And here's a partial list. And this is just biology, but biology's tough because it's so broad, and you can't write a good concept assessment for the whole field. So people have broken it up and written concept assessments, developed concept assessments for different sub-areas of biology. And I will leave these slides here with somebody, and so they can be posted, so you don't have to copy down this horrible URL here. But this gives this list and additional ones. And so if you're lucky and somebody's already done one of these, you can use it in the area that you're teaching. You can use it to measure learning gains during the course. And so if you have such an assessment, you can administer as a pretest, again as a post-test, maybe embedded in the final exam is one good way to do it. And then calculate for each student the normalized learning gain. That is, how much of the possible gain between their pretest and 100% did they actually get on the post-test. So now you've got an assay. You could actually do science on this of a sort. And so Jo Handelsman, when she wrote this book, which I know some of you are familiar with, used the term scientific teaching. It means applying this kind of an approach to the teaching. And this is a wonderful, I think, a very good introduction to a lot of the things I'm talking about. And it's very readable and easy and cheap, and I urge you to get a hold of a copy and read it if you're interested. So with this kind of a protocol, you can change something in your course, and then you can introduce different approaches and then measure the effects. And then go back and change the things again that didn't work for next year. So this is the summary of what I've been talking about. Develop learning objectives, which are specific and can be assessed. Use the kinds of things that research has shown are most effective to do in the classroom to help students achieve these objectives, and then measure learning gains with a pretest and a post-test. And I'll just show you a couple of examples of how these can be used. The first one is sort of interest to me because it was our first attempt at education research and applying some of these ideas. So shortly after the Summer Institute was developed and we started doing that, Jenny Knight, who was a colleague in Boulder, and I decided to try this in our developmental biology course, which we've been teaching to seniors for the last 20 years or so in a very traditional way. So we developed an assessment that we thought would be suitable for a pretest, post-test. We measured the learning gains of students in the traditional course the last time we taught it that way. And then in the following, and that's the purple bars, and then in the following semester, we didn't change that much. We took about a third of the lecture time, and instead of lecturing, used it for clicker questions, which were just starting to come into vogue, and other kinds of group problem-solving activities and discussions. And we were able to show a 30% increase, and that's the red bars the first time we did it, and the yellow bars in the following semester when we did it again. So we saw a 30% increase in the mean learning gains of the students. And so a lesson to us was you don't have to completely flip the course, as people say now. You can do this gradually and get some results and work into it slowly. This is a more complicated graph, but it illustrates how you can use this kind of an assessment to fine-tune the course. So this is from the genetics course, the genetics concept and assessment that we developed in Boulder. And each of the questions on the concept assessment is targeted toward a particular learning goal. So in this course, there were 9 fundamental learning goals in the genetics course. And they were tested by different questions on the assessment. And so purple is pre-test, green is the added performance on the post-test. And you can see that in some cases, we did a pretty good job. You know, and here in learning goal 4, I don't remember what that was. Students didn't know too much when they came in, but they learned quite a lot during the course. There were other cases where we didn't do very well at all. So here, unfortunately, only 1 question on this learning goal, but they started out low and they didn't really gain that much. So now you can go back to the course and say, well, the lectures, or the classes in this area really need to be, we need to do something about that and do a better job the next time. So it's a way to get specific data about how a course can be improved. The final thing I want to mention in terms of evidence is a meta-analysis that Scott Freeman has just completed at University of Washington. I think you know what a meta-analysis is, right? You take a lot of studies that have been done on something and pool the data in ways that allow you to extract the sort of the sum of all what the studies have shown. So Freeman and his colleagues looked at 229 studies that compared active learning versus traditional courses. What they found is that on average, the student performance was half a standard deviation higher in the active learning courses. So it's not Bloom's 2 sigma yet, but it's a significant advance. And furthermore, the failure rate was much lower. And Freeman has shown that in his course in Washington, he's essentially eliminated the performance gap between educationally underserved students and more traditional students by adopting some of these methods. So the inference is that if you adopt active learning techniques, on average, you're going to improve performance by a significant amount and reduce this failure rate by a significant amount also. So there's a lot of evidence out there that these approaches really can help students learn more than the traditional courses that we often teach. So let's switch now and talk a little bit about implementing some of this. How can we make these changes happen? So what are the barriers? I mean, the evidence is pretty clear, and yet a lot of people are not, few people are really changing, although this is starting to change. So what are the barriers? Well, there's a long list, so it's, and you can think of these as well as I can, but I'd like to just go down my list and say a little bit about some of these, and then maybe we can add more. So what are some of the barriers? Well, one is lack of awareness that there's a better way. There's research out there that shows clearly, as I hoped I've shown you, that active learning is a more productive way to spend class time than traditional lecture. 10 years ago, this was really a problem. Most people were unaware of the education research. Now I think most people are aware of it. You read in the newspaper, you hear things all the time about how we're not doing a good enough job at education at all levels, but including the college level and particularly in STEM fields. So this barrier, I think, is gradually going away as people learn more about it. Lack of appropriate classrooms. It's hard to do group learning in an auditorium like this. There's a couple of pieces of good news on that front. Several universities are now building specifically designed interactive classrooms. And as you probably know, you just have completed one, and it's being dedicated this afternoon, which is why Gary Smith is not here in the seminar. And it's beautiful. I urge you to go take a look at it if you haven't seen these classrooms yet. But these are specifically designed for student interaction. The room is filled with large round tables, equipped with computers and so on. So they're designed for this kind of interactive teaching. The other piece of good news is that you can do active learning pretty effectively even in a room like this. And a lot of people have done it very successfully. So that's really, it's not a good excuse anymore. And I think, again, this one is gradually going to get better. This is a huge one. And by this, I think you can see what I mean about this, the fear that you're not going to cover everything that needs to be covered. And in talking with people today, I realize how huge a problem that seems to be. And I think that is starting to get better also, because how many of you have read about flipped classrooms? You know, there's more and more acceptance of this idea that students don't have to be told everything that they need to learn in a course. They can be assigned reading, they can be assigned homework, they can be assigned videos to watch outside of class. And then during class, so they can accumulate, they can get the factual knowledge outside of class. In class, you can do the coaching that the students will require to really get the things that they didn't understand maybe on the homework, but also practice using them to increase their knowledge base. And so there's no limit to what you can cover. And what you can cover is not limited by 50 minutes of class time.